Your pain is optional. And if you're suffering right now, a part of you has chosen that suffering. The emotional wounds you carry, the grudges you nurse, the self-doubt that paralyzes you, these aren't merely responses to what life has done to you. They're choices you make every single day, often unconsciously, by rehearsing your hurts and reinforcing your limitations. Most people would rather be right about their suffering than be free from it. Most would rather blame circumstances than accept the terrifying power they possess to transform their emotional reality. Is that you? The moment you were born, you were given a gift, the most precious gift of all. Not a silver spoon, not a trust fund, not a legacy. You were given something far more valuable, the power to choose your own emotional response to life. Every single person in this room has this same extraordinary power. Yet how many of us have forgotten it? How many of us have surrendered it? How many of us have allowed the world to convince us that we are victims of circumstances rather than creators of our experience? Look at your hands. These hands that have held loved ones that have worked and built and created. These hands that have wiped away tears, both your own and others. These hands are physical manifestations of your power to act in this world. But there's something even more powerful than these hands that you possess. Your mind, your heart, your spirit. The invisible forces within you that determine not what happens to you, but how you respond to what happens. That's what emotional bulletproofing is all about. Not building walls, not becoming cold or unfeeling, not disconnecting from the world. It's about building an inner core so strong that nothing can penetrate it without your permission. It's about reclaiming the power that has always been yours. Every day we're bombarded. News headlines designed to trigger fear. Social media designed to make us feel inadequate. Advertising designed to create insecurity. Relationships that sometimes drain rather than sustain. The modern world is an emotional Minefield. And most of us are walking through it without any protection whatsoever. When someone criticizes you, what happens inside? When you face rejection, what happens inside? When you fail at something important, what happens inside? When someone you love hurts you, what happens inside? For too many of us, these external events determine our internal state. We are emotional reactors, not emotional creators. But what if it doesn't have to be that way? What if you could learn to become emotionally bulletproof? What if you could learn to navigate life's challenges without being wounded by them? What if you could experience the full depth of human emotion without being... That transformation is available to you right now, this very moment. Not tomorrow, not when you've read enough books or attended enough seminars or achieved enough success. Because becoming emotionally bulletproof isn't about adding something to yourself. It's about remembering who you truly are. Let me tell you about a young woman I met while giving a workshop. She approached me during a break, eyes filled with tears. For 20 years, she had been carrying around a burden of hurt from her childhood. Her father had abandoned the family when she was just 7 years old. And for 20 years, she had been telling herself a story. I wasn't enough for him to stay. 20 years of believing she was fundamentally unlovable. 20 years of entering relationships already expecting to be abandoned. 20 years of building walls to protect herself, only to find that those walls had become her prison. What changed for her? The realization that she'd been shot by an emotional bullet as a child, but she was the one who had kept the wound open for 20 years. She was the one who had denied herself the chance to heal. She was the one who had given her father's action the power to define her worth. And in that moment of realization, something shifted inside her. She began to understand that she could choose a different interpretation of her past. She could choose to see that her father's leaving had nothing to do with her worth and everything to do with his own limitations. She could choose to release herself from the prison she had built. That's emotional bulletproofing. It's not about denying that bullets exist. It's not about pretending they don't hurt when they hit. It's about learning not to carry those bullets inside you for a lifetime. How many bullets are you carrying? How many past hurts have you allowed to define your present? How many times have you told yourself, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not attractive enough, I'm not worthy of love, I'll never succeed. This is just how life is for me. These thoughts, these bullets, they don't just happen to you. They come from somewhere. Some were fired at you by parents who didn't know better by teachers who were hurting themselves, by peers who were insecure, by a society that profits from your self-doubt. But many, or perhaps most, were fired by you at yourself. Becoming emotionally bulletproof begins with this understanding. You cannot always control what happens to you, but you always have the power to choose how you respond. There's a world of difference between saying, I am depressed and I'm experiencing feelings of depression, between I am a failure and I experienced a failure, between I am hurt and I am feeling hurt. Right language matters because it shapes our reality. When you say I am something, you're claiming it as your identity. When you recognize that you are experiencing something, you maintain your identity as the observer, the chooser, the one who can decide what to do with that experience. This isn't mere semantics. This is the foundation of emotional freedom. This is the beginning of becoming bulletproof. Think of the most emotionally resilient person you know. The person who can face adversity without being destroyed by it. The person who maintains their center in the storm. What qualities do they embody? And CSR, they possess a profound understanding of their own worth that doesn't depend on external validation. They likely have a clear sense of purpose that transcends temporary setbacks. They probably practice forgiveness, not as a gift to others, but as a liberation for themselves. And they almost certainly maintain perspective, understanding that whatever is happening right now is just one chapter in a longer story. These qualities aren't innate. They're not genetic gifts bestowed on a lucky few. They're skills that can be developed, habits that can be cultivated, choices that can be made again and again until they become second nature. Let's talk about 4 pillars of emotional bulletproofing: self-awareness, boundary setting, meaning-making, and presence. Self-awareness is the foundation. You cannot change what you cannot see. Most people live their entire lives without ever truly examining the patterns of thought and emotion that drive their behavior. They're like drivers racing through life with a blindfold on, wondering why they keep crashing. Self-awareness means taking off the blindfold. It means becoming a witness to your own internal processes. Next time you feel an intense emotional reaction to something, try this. Instead of immediately acting on that emotion, pause. Notice the physical sensations in your body. Where do you feel the emotion? Is it a tightness in your chest? A knot in your stomach? A tension in your shoulders? Just observe without judgment. Then notice the thoughts accompanying that emotion. What story are you telling yourself about what's happening? Again, just observe. This simple practice, this pause, this noticing, creates space between stimulus and response. And in that space lies your power to change. A man once came to me after losing his job of 15 years. He was devastated, angry, frightened. As we talked, I asked him to identify the thoughts behind these feelings. At first he said, I'm thinking that I lost my job. But as we explored deeper, he began to recognize the actual thoughts. I'm too old to start over. I'll never find work that pays as well. I've wasted 15 years of my life. My family will think I'm a failure. Once he could see these thoughts clearly, he could question them. Were they true? Were they helpful? Were there other ways to interpret this situation? Gradually, he began to see possibilities where before he had seen only catastrophe, not because his circumstances had changed, but because his awareness had expanded. The second pillar is boundary setting. Many people believe that emotional bulletproofing means never feeling hurt. That's not true. It means knowing the difference between hurt that is inevitable in a fully lived life and hurt that comes from allowing your boundaries to be violated. Your boundaries are the rules of engagement for how others may treat you. They're not walls to keep people out. They're guidelines that teach people how to stay in. Setting healthy boundaries isn't selfish. It's an act of self-respect that actually allows for deeper, more authentic connections. A teacher I know struggled with burnout for years. She gave everything to her students, answering emails at midnight, spending weekends creating extra materials for those who were struggling, allowing parents to call her personal phone at all hours. She believed that setting boundaries would make her less effective as a teacher, less caring. In reality, her lack of boundaries led to exhaustion, resentment, and diminished effectiveness in the classroom. When she finally began setting boundaries, office hours for student questions, designated times for parent communications, personal time that was truly personal. Something remarkable happened. Not only did her well-being improve, but her teaching did too. She came to class energized rather than depleted. She was fully present rather than partially burned out. And her students responded to that presence, that energy. By honoring her own needs, she became better able to serve others. That's the paradox of boundaries. They don't diminish our connections. They enhance them by ensuring that when we give, we're giving from fullness rather than emptiness. The third pillar is meaning-making. Humans are meaning-making creatures. We can't help it. When something happens, we immediately begin constructing a story about what it means. The problem is that most of us do this unconsciously, automatically defaulting to interpretations that disempower us rather than empower us. Consider two people who experience the same setback. Let's say a business venture that fails. One person constructs a meaning that says, "This proves I'm not cut out for entrepreneurship. I was foolish to try." The other constructs a meaning that says, "This is valuable feedback. Now I know what doesn't work," which puts me one step closer to finding what does. Same external event, radically different meanings, radically different emotional responses, radically different future actions. Becoming emotionally bulletproof means becoming consciously involved in the meaning-making process. It means recognizing that meaning isn't inherent in events themselves. It's assigned by you. And if you're doing the assigning, you can choose meanings that serve your growth rather than meanings that keep you stuck. A woman in one of my seminars shared that she had gone through a painful divorce after 20 years of marriage. For the first year afterward, the meaning she made was entirely self-diminishing. I failed at the most important relationship in my life. I wasted 2 decades. I'm unlovable. These meanings kept her in a state of depression and self-love. With support, she began to consciously create new meanings. I had the courage to leave a situation that wasn't serving either of us. Those 20 years gave me beautiful children and important life lessons. This is an opportunity to rediscover parts of myself that were dormant in that relationship. As her meaning changed, her emotional experience transformed. Not because her past changed, but because her relationship to it did. The fourth pillar is presence. Most emotional suffering comes from living in the past or the future rather than the present moment. Regret, resentment, and guilt keep us tethered to the past. Anxiety, worry, and fear project us into an imagined future. Meanwhile, the only moment in which we can actually take constructive action, experience joy, or make meaningful choices, this moment, slips by largely unlived. Presence isn't just a spiritual ideal. It's a practical tool for emotional resilience. When you're fully present, you're not adding layers of interpretation and projection onto your experience. You're dealing with what's actually happening rather than what you fear might happen or what you wish had happened differently. A man struggling with chronic anxiety learned a simple presence practice. Bringing his awareness fully into his 5 senses for just 1 minute at a time, multiple times throughout the day. What do I see right now? What do I hear? What do I feel against my skin? What do I smell? What do I taste? This simple practice repeatedly interrupted the anxiety cycle by bringing him back to the concrete reality of the present moment, where, more often than not, he was actually safe and well, despite his mind's catastrophic projections. These 4 pillars of me, self-awareness, boundary setting, meaning-making, and presence, form the foundation of emotional bulletproofing. But there's another element we need to address: the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Identity, your sense of who you are at the most fundamental level, is perhaps the most powerful force in human psychology. People will act in accordance with their identity even when it hurts them to do so. If you identify as someone who always struggles with money, you'll find ways to ensure that remains true, even if it means sabotaging financial opportunities. If you identify as someone who isn't creative, you'll never give yourself permission to explore your creative potential. The most empowering identity shift you can make is from viewing yourself as a finished product to viewing yourself as a work in progress. From this is just who I am to this is who I am becoming. This shift opens the door to possibility rather than a common misconception about emotional bulletproofing is that it means becoming less sensitive, less feeling, Nothing could be further from the truth. Emotional bulletproofing isn't about feeling less. It's about suffering less from what you feel. It's about expanding your capacity to experience the full range of human emotions without being destabilized by them. Think about it this way. If you touch a hot stove, pain is the appropriate response. That pain is giving you important information that protects you from harm. The problem isn't the pain, it's what happens if you continue to feel that pain long after you've removed your hand from the stove. That's suffering, and it serves no purpose. Similarly, if you experience betrayal, grief, disappointment, or failure, emotional pain is natural and appropriate. That pain carries important information about your values, your boundaries, your needs. The problem comes when that pain transforms into ongoing suffering. When the initial wound is compounded by stories of victimhood, inadequacy, or helplessness, emotional bulletproofing is about feeling the pain when it's informative and then letting it go when it's no longer serving you. It's about responding to life's challenges from your center rather than from your wounds. This brings us to the concept of responsibility, the ability to choose your response. Between every stimulus and your response to it lies a space. In that space is your power and your freedom. Most people never discover this space because they react so quickly, so automatically that stimulus and response seem fused together, but they're not. There's always a space, even if it's only microseconds long. And you can learn to expand that space. When someone criticizes you, there's a space before you feel hurt or defensive. When you face a setback, there's a space before you feel discouraged. When you see an opportunity, there's a space before you feel excited or in these spaces, these tiny windows of freedom, lies your power to choose a response that aligns with who you want to be rather than defaulting to who you've been. A young man I worked with had a pattern of explosive anger that was destroying his relationships. Someone does something he perceives as disrespectful. He feels a flash of anger. He lashes out verbally, sometimes physically. He feels shame. He promises himself it won't happen again. Repeat. Through practice, he learned to expand the space between the trigger and his response. He couldn't control the initial flash of anger that was automatic, but he could learn to recognize it as a signal rather than an imperative to act. He could learn to create a pause, to breathe, to ask himself, what's really happening here? What am I telling myself about this situation? Is that story true? How do I want to respond as the person I'm aspiring to be, not the person I've been by default? Over time, this practice transformed not only his behavior, but his actual emotional experience. The flash of anger still came. He was human, after all, but it no longer controlled him. He had discovered the space between stimulus and response, and in doing so, he had discovered his freedom. This is available to all of us. This power to choose our response is our birthright. But like any power, it must be claimed to be used. It must be practiced to be strengthened. Let's talk about practical strategies for building emotional bulletproofing in everyday life. First, develop a meditation practice. It doesn't have to be elaborate. Even 5 minutes a day can begin to change your relationship with your thoughts and emotions. Meditation is like weight training for awareness. It strengthens your ability to notice your thoughts without being completely identified with them. Second, practice conscious breathing. Your breath is always with you, making it the perfect tool for centering yourself in challenging moments. When you feel emotionally triggered, take 3 deep breaths, extending the exhale longer than the inhale. This simple practice activates your parasympathetic nervous system, bringing you out of fight or flight and into a state where you can choose your response rather than just react. Third, cultivate gratitude. Gratitude and victimhood cannot coexist. When you're genuinely focused on what you appreciate, you cannot simultaneously be focused on what you lack or what has hurt you. Make it a daily practice to identify 3 specific things you're grateful for. Not just listing them, but actually feeling the gratitude in your body. Fourth, surround yourself with emotionally bulletproof people. We become like those we spend time with. If you're constantly around people who are reactive, who see themselves as victims, who interpret everything in the most negative light possible, that will influence you. Seek out people who respond to life's challenges with resilience, wisdom, and grace. 5th, engage in regular self-reflection. At the end of each day, ask yourself, what triggered me today? How did I respond? Was my response aligned with who I want to be? What story was I telling myself in that moment? Was that story true? Was it helpful? What alternative interpretation might be equally or more true? 6th, practice radical forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness. Holding on to resentment toward others is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Holding on to self-condemnation is drinking an even more potent poison. Forgiveness doesn't mean condoning harmful behavior or denying its impact. It means releasing the emotional charge of the past so that it no longer controls your present. 7th, develop a strong connection to purpose. When you know what matters most to you, when you have a clear sense of your values and your contribution, you become much less vulnerable to the opinions and actions of others. Purpose provides a North Star that can guide you through the stormy seas of life. 8, take care of your physical body. Emotional resilience is not just psychological, it's also biological. Regular exercise, adequate sleep, proper nutrition, these aren't luxuries. They're necessities for emotional bulletproofing. Your body and mind are not separate entities. They're part of one integrated system. These practices aren't one-time fixes. They're ongoing commitments. Emotional bulletproofing isn't a destination you reach. It's a path you walk daily. There will still be days when you get triggered, when you react from old patterns, when you forget your power to choose. That's part of being human. The difference is that with practice, those days become less frequent and less intense. You recover more quickly. You learn from the experience rather than being defined by it. Remember the young woman I mentioned earlier? The one who had carried the wound of her father's abandonment for 20 years? After our workshop, she wrote to me about her progress. She described a moment when a man she was dating suddenly ended their relationship. In the past, this would have confirmed her core belief: I'm unlovable. Everyone leaves. This time was different. Yes, she felt the pain. Yes, she grieved the loss of what might have been. But she didn't make it mean something about her inherent worth. She didn't add the suffering of, I knew this would happen, to the natural pain of disappointment. She allowed herself to feel the emotions without being defined by them. And then, that's emotional bulletproofing in action. Not an absence of wounds, but a presence of healing. Not an absence of feelings, but a presence of choice about what those feelings mean and how long you carry them. We all face bullets in this life. Criticism, rejection, loss, failure, betrayal. We cannot control that reality, but we can decide whether those bullets lodge within us, festering into bitterness and limitation, or whether they pass through us, leaving wisdom but not wounds in their wake. The difference lies in how we relate to our emotions. Are they masters or messengers? Do they define us or inform us? Do they control us or guide us? When you become emotionally bulletproof, you don't stop feeling. You feel more fully, more richly, more accurately, because your feelings are no longer distorted by the accumulated pain of the past or the projected fears of the future. You feel clean emotions rather than compound emotions. You feel the natural response to what's happening now rather than the triggered response based on what happened then. Imagine living that way, responding to life freshly, clearly, creatively, rather than automatically, fearfully, defensively. Imagine meeting each moment on its own terms rather than through the lens of past hurts. Imagine knowing so deeply that you are not your emotions. You are the awareness in which emotions arise and dissipate, that nothing can threaten your core sense of. That's freedom. That's power. That's what's available to you right now. In this moment, through the choices you make about how you relate to your own inner experience. This path isn't easy. It requires courage to face yourself honestly. It requires discipline to practice new ways of responding when old patterns feel so familiar. It requires faith to believe that you can change patterns that may have been, but consider the alternative. Consider the cost of remaining emotionally vulnerable, not in the beautiful sense of authentic connection, but in the limiting sense of being constantly at the mercy of circumstances and other people's behavior. Consider what it costs you in relationships, in opportunities, in peace of mind and health and the simple joy of being alive. The journey to emotional bulletproofing begins with a decision to reclaim your power to choose your response to life. No one can make that decision for you. No one can walk that path for you. But if you choose it, you'll discover that you're not alone. Throughout human history, wisdom traditions have pointed to this same truth. Your freedom lies not in controlling external events, but in mastering your internal response. As you leave here today, I invite you to begin with one simple practice. The next time you feel emotionally triggered, pause. Just pause. Take a breath. Notice what's happening in your body. Notice what story you're telling yourself. Don't try to change anything yet. Just notice. That noticing is the first crack in the walls of automatic reaction. That noticing is the beginning of freedom. You were born with the power to choose your response to life. Perhaps you've forgotten that power amidst the bombardment of daily challenges. Perhaps you've given it away to others. Perhaps you've never fully claimed it. But it remains yours, waiting to be reclaimed, waiting to be remembered, waiting to transform your experience of being alive. Emotional bulletproofing isn't about becoming hard or impenetrable. It's about becoming so flexible, so resilient, so grounded in your true nature that nothing can destroy your peace of mind without your permission. It's about remembering that you are not what happens to you. You are what you choose to become in response to what happens. That choice is yours. It always has been, and it begins anew in this moment